weeks ago, somebody gave me a beautiful little book entitled The Alchemist. It's the story of a young man who is a shepherd in southern Spain, the Andalusian area of Spain, some centuries ago. And this young man meets a prophet, a seer, and he shares a vision with him. And he tells the young man that somewhere out there at the foot of some pyramid is buried a treasure. And if he would just find a way to set himself free and follow his heart and go on this journey, he would discover this buried treasure. And the young man, who is a wayfarer at heart, a sojourner, a seeker, makes the decision that he's to sell his sheep and separate himself from his life and his security and his childhood sweetheart and all the things that bind him to that place, and set out on this journey in search of this buried treasure, which really represents something much more than a treasure, but that's another part of the story. At any rate, he sets out across southern Spain and eventually into Morocco, and he makes and loses fortunes. He meets the love of his life. He encounters sheiks and caliphs and bandits and prophets and seers, and finally, after this long and incredible journey, he makes his way to the foot of the Great Pyramid across these many miles of desert, and he begins to dig. And he digs, and suddenly he's interrupted by these two bandits who begin to beat him and pummel him, and they beat him almost to death, and they rob the gold that he has in his pockets, and they demand to know what he's doing digging out in the desert at the foot of the pyramid. And finally he breaks down and says, I'm looking for buried treasure. And then they begin to laugh, and they no longer beat him, and they say, "Oh, you're just a stupid fool. Who would dig in the desert for buried treasure?" In fact, one of the bandits says, "I myself have had a recurrent dream of buried treasure at this dilapidated monastery in southern Spain, where there's an old sycamore tree growing out of the ruins. And I'm smart enough to know that I would never leave my life and travel thousands of miles to dig in the desert for buried treasure." And so they leave. They leave the young man stranded in the middle of the desert. And then after they leave, the young man begins to laugh because he realizes that the location that this bandit has just described is the very place that this young man has left. It's his home. And he had spent many hours as a child at the foot of this old sycamore in this dilapidated monastery. And he makes his way back home. And he digs in that spot. A tree that he'd sat under for many, many hours. And he digs 3 feet, 6 feet, and suddenly the shovel hits a metal object. And he opens the chest, and there's a treasure of gold coins. It's a beautiful little story, and now that I've ruined the ending for you, you may want to read it anyway. But it's so interesting. You know, if you want to find buried treasure, you don't have to go any further than your own backyard to dig. Buried treasure. Now, Jesus defined buried treasure as something called the kingdom of God. Now, at the very core and essence of many of the teachings of Jesus is this concept, the kingdom of God. But it's such a kind of an esoteric, ephemeral concept that most of us don't get it. It's hard for me to explain it. In fact, most people in Jesus' day didn't get it either. They didn't get a lot of what he said. And he didn't even try to teach them in a didactic way, in a real theological way. He simply told stories. And he told a lot of stories about the kingdom of God. It was so important. It was that big in his teaching. He said, the kingdom of God it's kind of like this and it's kind of like that. Kind of worked around the edges trying to define what it was. And he told some really cool stories about the kingdom. I'm going to tell you one of them about this buried treasure. But in trying to get my mind around the deepest meaning of the kingdom of God, I came across a passage from an author, a guy I really like. His name is Stephen Mitchell. And he wrote a book entitled A New Translation of the Gospels for Believers and Unbelievers. It's a book well worth reading. Not only translates the gospel stories in contemporary language, but lines them up against various wisdom teachings from various faith traditions, Islam and Buddhism and so forth. And I find more and more remarkable similarities in all of these teachings. So the gospel for believers and unbelievers. Boy, we believers need the gospel, the good news, that we are known and loved by God, but unbelievers appreciate it even more. So let me read this passage from Stephen Mitchell, because I think it encapsulates the deepest meanings of the kingdom in words that I can understand. When Jesus talked about the kingdom of God, he wasn't prophesying about some easy, danger-free perfection that will someday appear. He was talking about a state of being, a way of living at ease among the joy and sorrows of our world. This state of being is not something alien or mystical. We don't need to earn it. It is already ours. Most of us lose it as we grow up and become self-conscious, but it doesn't disappear forever. It is always there to be reclaimed, though we have to search hard in order to find it. The rich especially have a hard time re-entering this state of being. They are so possessed by their possessions, so entrenched in their social power, that it's almost impossible for them to let go. But not that it's easy for any of us, but if we need reminding, we can always sit at the feet of our young children. Entering the kingdom of God means feeling as if we were floating in the womb of the universe, that we're being taken care of at every moment. Jesus spoke of people entering it and said that if we would only stop looking forward and backward and devote ourselves to seeking that which is right beneath our feet and right under our noses, we would find it. And when we find it, food and clothing and other necessities are given to us as well, as they are to the lilies and the birds. And where else but here and now can we find the grace-bestowing, inexhaustible presence of God? In its light, all our hopes and fears flitter away like ghosts. It is a treasure buried in a field. It is like coming home. When we find it, and we realize that we can afford to lose everything else in the world and still find ourselves rich beyond all dreams.